Welcome everyone to another Keats-Shelley Association of America video interview. I'm Anna Mercer, the Keats-Shelley Association Director of Communications. And today we're thinking and talking about all things Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. We're so honored to be interviewing Professor Jerry Hogle and Professor Anne K. Mellor, following the very recent publication of a special issue of the Huntington Library Quarterly entitled Frankenstein and Its Environments, Then and Now. This special issue was edited by Professor Hogle and is available to read online now. There's a link to the edition in the text under this video. The collection actually stems from the 2018 conference, Frankenstein, Then and Now, 1818 to 2018, at the Huntington Library and Museum. This event was chaired by Professor Hogle and Professor Mellor, and it celebrated the bicentennial of Frankenstein's publication by bringing together major experts from around the world to discuss this widely influential monster story about the creation of artificial life. Building on the long history of Shelley criticism, the essays in the present collection just published look at the novel from the perspectives of critical race theory, feminism, eco-criticism, and brain science, among others. Now to introduce our interviewees. Professor Jerry Hogle is Professor Emeritus and University Distinguished Professor at the University of Arizona's Department of English. He was named a Distinguished Scholar of the Keats-Shelley Association of America in 2012. He has published extensively on English Romantic literature, literary and cultural theory, and the many different forms of the Gothic. His books include, among others, Shelley's Process from Oxford University Press. Professor Anne K. Mellor is Distinguished Research Professor of English and Women's Studies at UCLA. Her scholarly interests focus on 18th and 19th century British literature, women's writing, feminist theory, and the visual arts. She is the author of, amongst other texts, and I had many to choose from, of course, her favorites, Mothers of the Nation, Women's Political Writing in England, 1780 to 1830, English Romantic Irony, and of course, Mary Shelley, Her Fiction, Her Life, Her Monsters. In 1999, she was awarded the Keats-Shelley Association of America Distinguished Scholar Award. So joining me to interview Jerry and Anne today are our two communications fellows for this academic year, Mariam Wasif and Amy Wilcoxon. And I think Mariam has the first question for Anne and Jerry.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thank you very much, Jerry and Anne, for being with us. It's an honor to have you. So as Jerry explains in the introduction, the title of the collection, Frankenstein and Its Environments, Then and Now, refers to the many kinds of environments in which Mary Shelley's novel was both created and received, right up to our present moment. So can you tell us a bit about some of the most important kinds of environments that the collection considers?
Yes, there are so many, we couldn't consider them all. But the most obvious is, of course, the climate change environment. That discussion, it was actually raging at the time Mary Shelley's novel was begun because of the terrible summer weather that they had in the summer of 1816. And of course, the climate change environment is here today. But there's also literary environments, all the texts that the novel interacts with before and during its time. There were the scientific debates of its day, which took many different forms and reflected in many different ways in Frankenstein. There was the climate of racism and racial debate over slavery, which figures into the novel in powerful and surprising ways. And then in the 20th century and the 21st century, there's the whole setting now of artificial intelligence, stem cell biology, assisted reproduction, and gene editing, all of which Frankenstein speaks to and has led it to be revived, whether it was a 200th anniversary or not. Plus, every time you try to adapt Frankenstein, there's already the novel and many other adaptations that form the environment out of which an adaptation is done. We wanted to discuss a major adaptation and the setting out of which it came that has had an immediate and recent effect. On top of that, there are the environments mentioned already of criticism. Different environments of criticism interpret Frankenstein differently, and we wanted to highlight those too. So we couldn't even encompass all the environments that Frankenstein speaks to and comes from.
So Frankenstein is a story that's known by many people, and it's been written on countless times by a range of scholars in a variety of contexts. So I was wondering, in what ways does this new collection offer readers, scholars and students something different, something original, something exciting and new about Shelley's text?
Well, there are literary precursors that are discovered for the first time, particularly a translation of a French text about a natural man, a savage man who was discovered in France. But there's also not just the fact that there was a terrible dark summer that came from a volcanic eruption in 1816, which people have known, but Gillen Darcy Wood shows how very particular things in Frankenstein itself reflect the things that actually happened to people as a result of that terrible environment. There's also the fact that in all the scientific debates, there are some things that have not been pulled out about that affected Frankenstein before. There's the whole idea of animal breeding and how much effect it had on Frankenstein, since he puts the creature together from animals as well as people. There's the whole issue of scientific regulation. How does science regulate itself, which has not been discussed in relation to Frankenstein before and is here. There's the whole idea of brain science, even though we don't actually see a brain in the original novel the way you do in some adaptations. It turns out that an awful lot of what was being said about brain science at the time has an effect on Frankenstein and is reflected there. And we haven't seen that before. We also have not, of course, had someone like Henry Greeley from Stanford, major law professor and leader in the discussion of legal debates over gene editing and so on, put Frankenstein in the perspective of all the debates that are going on now, from artificial intelligence through gene editing. I've never seen a piece that pulls all of that together in the way that Henry was able to do for us. Plus, we were able to have an interview with Nick Deere, the author of the 2011 Frankenstein play from the National Theatre of Great Britain, who gave us the most thorough discussion I think I've ever seen of how that production came about and how it deals with the fact that there were already so many Frankensteins. Why do you create this one as opposed to other ones? And I don't think any of those things have ever been discussed or presented in any venue like this before.
Thank you. That's so exciting, and the Frankenstein play is such an amazing production as well, isn't it? I really enjoyed watching that.
Well, so. And we had to decide in the conference, what do we highlight, and we came to that one pretty quickly because it was so extraordinary.
Yeah, brilliant production. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, sorry. Over to you, Anna. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Jerry, for such insightful answers to the questions about the publication. But for a moment, I want to step back and go back to the conference that the publication grew out of. So this was, as I said, a conference at the Huntington Library in 2018, that great celebratory year for Frankenstein where there was so much going on. The event had a wonderful schedule of speakers and appears to me to be an event to recognize the kind of breadth of ideas about Frankenstein that were circulating at the time. And I just want to use this quote that Jerry says in his essay in the publication about the recent scholarship on Frankenstein that has come out of late. Quote, "The myriad sources, ideas, and cultural debates, as well as the symbolism and art that appear in Frankenstein, which is an extraordinary range for a book written by a brilliant 18 to 19-year-old, and the many issues, possibilities, and problems of modernity that the novel anticipates and continues to challenge us about into the 21st century." There's just a great quote to encapsulate what is so fascinating about Mary Shelley's book. And so I would like to ask Anne about the conference and this recognition of cutting edge scholarship, which becomes all the more important when we consider the global attention that the novel received due to the bicentenary. So can you tell us a bit about your vision for the Shelleyan conference and how unique it was in such an important bicentenary year for Mary Shelley?
Yes, when I first went to the Huntington Library, to the Director of Research, Steve Hindle, and also to the California Institute of Technology, the Dean of Humanities, Kevin Gilmartin, asking them for the money considerable amount of money that we would need to staff this conference, I had to make an argument that this conference would be absolutely unique among all the Mary Shelley bicentenary celebrations. And so the argument I made was that not only would we have leading scholars of the text there, which we did, but we would also pay equal attention to the film history. So we had one scholar who was addressing the original Frankenstein with Boris Karloff, right down to present day versions. But I also said I wanted to have Nick Dear come to the conference to present the National Theater version of the film, which we actually were able to show during the conference because he brought his own copy of it to us. You know, it's not out, it's not even under copyright, really. It's kind of a private performance now that only the National Theater otherwise can release. So we were able to show that. And I said I wanted to have a conversation with him in the process. When I wrote to him to invite him to do this, he said, I've never attended an academic conference like this in my life before, but since now I'm being a little self-referential, but he said, since your book on Mary Shelley was the book that inspired me to take the approach to the play that I did, because of that, I will come because I would like to meet you and have a conversation with you. So we actually did an interview during the conference after we showed the film. And then the other thing I was equally insistent on, because after all, this was Caltech that was going to put up some money, was that we were going to represent fully, I think for the first time, the way in which the text speaks to very contemporary scientific issues. And the one that I actually think is most relevant is genetic engineering, CRISPR-Cas9. And so not only did I have Hank Greeley come, who's someone I had known from the past, but I also insisted, and amazingly, she agreed. We had Jennifer Doudna, who invented CRISPR and just got the Nobel Prize for doing so. She actually came to the conference and gave a talk on CRISPR and its implications for the future. It turns out that both her parents were English teachers, which I did not know when I got in touch with her. And she said it was such a delight to be with English scholars talking about novels rather than talking about molecules. So it was wonderful to have her there. And it really transformed the weight of the conference. So as much of the attention was being paid not to just the scholars, but to the way in which Frankenstein, the myth of Frankenstein, really animates contemporary discussions of anything that's going wrong. I mean, for a while, I was kind of relentlessly keeping copies of any newspaper mentions, journalistic media mentions of Frankenstein. And it comes up, not just in relation to science, it comes up in relation to politics, and of course, climate change, anything where something happens with unintended consequences. You'll always see Frankenstein invoked, which is an extraordinary fact, because it means that a novel that an 18-year-old girl wrote, over 200 years ago, has become a myth. It's become the myth of modern culture about what can go wrong. And nowadays, a lot of things are going wrong. So you'll hear more and more about Frankenstein because of that. And I have to say, at the end of the conference, Kevin Gilmartin came up to me and he said, Anne, I can't believe you pulled this off. You took so many risks. I've never seen so many risks taken with a single conference, but it worked. We got the film shown. We got Jennifer Doudna there. We even started the conference actually with if you came down the night before, a lecture by David Baltimore, another Nobel Prize winner, on the problems with genetic engineering. So he was already raising those issues before Jennifer Doudna addressed them directly. So
that was Kevin Gilmartin's idea, and it hooked up very nicely with the conference. And he helped enormously. Steve Hindle at Huntington helped us enormously, and we just decided to shoot high. And we asked the best people that we could, and pretty much all of them said yes.
Yeah, it was amazing.
As busy as she was, she stayed for the whole conference. She was involved with the whole thing. Not only did she talk beautifully, but she brought in Frankenstein very well. It couldn't have gone better, except for a hiccup here and there from our point of view.
It sounds like an absolutely fascinating conference. I've never been to anything like it. I wish I could have been there to see the interdisciplinarity and people from inside and outside the Academy. So you mentioned, both Jerry and Anna mentioned a little while ago, the adaptation by Nick Dear. So I'm going to ask a follow-up question about that. One of the articles in the volume is called Adapting the Unthinkable, and it's the interview that Anne conducted with Nick Dear, the playwright, as we said, who authored the 2011 stage adaptation, Frankenstein, based on the novel by Mary Shelley. And a major innovation of the play is that, at least at first, it presents the whole story from the creature's point of view. And it sounds like Nick Dear might have been influenced by Anne's book, perhaps making these choices. So that's different, of course, from the novel, which contains these nested narratives told by Robert Walton, Victor Frankenstein, and the creature. So how do you think grounding the creature's perspective changes the story?
Well, I thought it actually made a huge difference. If you've seen the play or the film that they have released of the play, you know that it starts with this huge red bubble, and basically you see a form inside the bubble, and then that form gradually emerges. That's the creature, of course, coming to life. Depending on whether it's played by Benedict Cumberbatch or Johnny Miller, they had slightly different ways of moving the creature to full realization where he can actually stand up. Johnny Miller actually had a toddler, a 2-year-old toddler at home while he was acting in the play. And so he based his performance on what his 1-year-old, 2-year-old could do. Whereas Benedict Cumberbatch went to hospitals where they were doing rehabilitation exercises with veterans who were learning how to walk again. But both of them, what was so amazing was that it was 6 minutes before Victor Frankenstein even appears on the stage. So you're entirely with the creature through his whole birth process, coming to consciousness, being able to stand up, being able to speak. And of course, when Victor Frankenstein does appear in the play version, not in the text, but in the play version, the one thing he says is, "Damn," and then he runs off. That was Danny Boyle's intervention, actually. He was, whereas in the script it said, "Get out, get out." And after that, of course, you really are following the creature's experiences. So the play becomes much more a play about child development, child abuse, the ways in which the creature is rejected everywhere he goes, until he finally meets the blind Mr. DeLacy and learns how to recite Milton. That's quite an advance within, an hour, but nonetheless. And I think what the play does, the novel does this as well, but I don't think previous commentary on the novel had focused on this as much. It's a play about how a monster is created by society, by social rejection, rather than by a single scientist. And I think that makes all the difference for seeing the novel's influence on contemporary culture, that we can see all the ways in which it's commenting on all the abuses, whether it's slavery or climate pollution or scientific, advances that may be uncomfortable. All of that became very, very clear in the play. Ending with a wonderful scene, of course, where the creature and Frankenstein are following each other in the North Pole. And as Nick Dear pointed out, that's a double helix. I don't know if you could see that as it went, in figure 8 going back and forth. So he wanted to bring the scientific reference right back to the fore at the very end of the play. I think it's a brilliant play, brilliant production. And it's really sad that they can't just release it so everyone could buy it, because Danny Boyle did not control the filming of it, and therefore he will not let his name be used on it. So there you have a little ego at work.
And we did have to make special arrangements with the film releasing arm of the National Theater to get this. And that was to some degree out of Danny Boyle's and Nick Dear's control. But fortunately, they understood what we were trying to do and did let us use the film of the play for a reasonable price.
Right.
That's so frustrating, but amazing that you were able to get that in the end.
It's such an amazing production as well, isn't it? The just as you say, Nan, about the birth scene and all the lights are flashing, and it's just it's an incredible production. And this is a bit of a cheeky question that I just thought I'd interject with, but which actor did you prefer as the creature?
Oh, Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yeah. Did you? Yeah, that's the version I saw.
That's surprising.
And I might comment that that's who Nick Dear brought. I mean, the version we saw was with Benedict Cumberbatch as the creature.
Well, I saw them both too, and I thought they were both brilliant, really. But Benedict Cumberbatch was extraordinary. I have to agree.
Yeah, no, that's the version I saw, and I really enjoyed it. And sorry, that was a bit of a cheeky interjected question there, but I'll continue on.
What do you call them? A Cumberbatch fan?
Yeah, me too. We've been talking throughout this interview so far about how relevant Frankenstein is during the 21st century. It contains many of the concerns and the issues, such as debates around race, slavery, eco-criticism, as we've said, that are also relevant at the moment. So I was wondering, in what ways do you think Frankenstein will continue to resonate, perhaps over the next 200 years? Don't know who wants to start.
Well, I think we're just at the beginning of a continual series of debates back and forth about how far artificial intelligence should go, how far stem cell biology should go. I mean, we have huge debates about the use of stem cells at all, about how assisted reproduction, how far should that go? Are we going to have designer babies as a result of CRISPR-Cas9? And therefore, what do we say about the whole editing of genes? I think that whole series of debates is going to go on and on and on for some time. And it should, because they're vexed issues. And Jennifer Doudna even was able to say, yes, Frankenstein speaks to all of those, but it also speaks to issues about race and about the working class, how people are treated, where people are placed, whether we can control our environment or whether our environment controls us. It speaks to issues of education. How are people supposed to be taught? How can we expand education to the widest range of people, given the different backgrounds that they come from? And what are we doing with our environment? I mean, now there's all kinds of environmental criticism about Frankenstein, where the monster appears as a creation from nature that shows that nature has its own powers and human beings cannot control it so much. So the number of issues that are starting to expand and expand, I think, are going to last for a very long time. And Frankenstein speaks to all of those.
Yeah, I would only underline all the, at least in America, the big issue at the moment, of course, is diversity and systemic racism. And the fact that the creature is yellow-skinned. At the moment, we're having Asian attacks because of the Chinese flu, theoretically. So its contemporary reach is really quite extraordinary because, anything that you're worried about seems to have a foothold in that novel.
As Anne herself has pointed out, the creature has black lips and yellow skin, as well as white features. He's a racial mixture. And that whole issue of what racial mixture and multicultural existence means is enormous. And Frankenstein speaks to it in ways that Anne and many others have seen so well.
Mary Shelley getting a lot of attention with that, and of course with her pandemic-related novel, The Last Man, in discourse at the moment, which something we don't have time to talk about today, but hopefully maybe we will at some other point. So thinking again about the future, my final question for you both, I want to turn it back to the original text, Mary Shelley's original words, and thinking about Mary Shelley and composition. So it's a bit of a selfish question, something I would always want to put to both of you two as Shelley experts, but I'm really interested in the manuscript of Frankenstein. I think it is still a document that is really important, and I know you agree, but I just wanted to ask you about that the manuscript, Charles E. Robinson's obviously seminal work on it. And I wanted to ask you, how crucial do you think an understanding of the manuscript will continue to be as Shelley studies progress in decades to come?
Well, I think for any scholar working on either the text or Mary Shelley's life, they will have to go back to the manuscript. It's where I began my research, actually, in the Bodleian Library. And I should say, when I started that 40 years ago, I was really one of the first people even to call up the manuscript. And of course, it's not complete. We don't have the entire novel in the manuscript, which is one of the problems with using it in the classroom. But they brought it to me in a yellow folder. Every page was just loose. Mary Shelley's own emendations, written on little pieces of paper, longhand, of course, were literally pinned onto the manuscript, and the pins were still there. And after I worked my way through it all, I went to the librarian and I said, you know, every scrap of paper you have by Percy Shelley is enclosed in its separate plastic container. I think you might want to do that with this manuscript, because at any point when I was working on it, I could have walked out with a page. They would never have known. I could have walked out with many pages. They would never have known. They weren't counting them. They weren't keeping track. Now, of course, they've decided it's very valuable, and you have to be a very high level scholar to get access to it. And that's a good thing, but maybe it was fun to work with. You know, I was feeling the pages that she had written on. Any case, setting that aside, one of the main arguments I was making in my book was the extent to which that manuscript was, now scholars will argue about this, improved or damaged by Percy Shelley's editorial revisions, which were, of course, extensive, although primarily stylistic rather than content. Although I think the ending, which he changed, made a huge difference, that the original manuscript, the creature is clearly still alive. He's out there, whereas in Percy Shelley's revision, he's gone into darkness and distance. He's finished, ended, dead. The problem, though, with teaching it, I have tried to teach the manuscript, and students really like her style, which is much more vernacular, much easier to read. I mean, it was Percy Shelley who insisted that the creature talk like Horace, you know, in sort of classical diction and polysyllabic terms, relentlessly, you know, raise the diction of the piece. But the real problem with the manuscript is that it's incomplete in some really critical places. We just don't have all the pages. So to effectively use it, you have to kind of switch back and forth between the original manuscript and the first 1818 published edition, which you can do with this paperback edition. I don't know if you've ever actually seen this one. I think it was put out by the Bodleian Library. Vintage does it in America. You can do it, but it's a challenge. So I actually don't think it's going to become the text that most people will, unfortunately, first encounter the novel. But I do think what's happened over the last 40 years is that we've moved from the 1831 edition to the 1818 edition as the primary text that everyone now is reading, that paperback publishers are reissuing. And that makes a huge difference, because it is still much closer to her original vision than after everyone around her had died. And she goes back, and I think actually in the 1831 edition introduces an entire new character called Destiny, or Fate, that controls everything that's happening. Whereas in the first 1818, well, in the manuscript, it's human choice. It's free will. Victor Frankenstein has a choice about whether he's going to do this or not. He could stop at any point. Whereas in the 1831, fate determines that he will carry on. So at least, go ahead, Jerry.
Anne and Charles and many others, we've come back to the 1818 text, and that's what our collection celebrates.
Yeah,
and what the conference celebrates. For so long, the 1831 revision was the standard text for teaching. And now, quite rightly, it's not. And because of the work of Anne and Charles and so many others, we've come back to the focus where it should be. And I think we kept it there in the conference and in the collection.
That's so interesting, yeah, because having only come to teaching at a university level a few years ago, the 1880 text just seems something that would be the teaching text now, and that change is really, really fascinating to hear about, definitely. Well, that's come to the end of our questions for you both today. And I just want to thank you both so much for participating in this interview for the Keats-Shelley Association of America, especially. It's an honor to have you as the two distinguished scholars as well. We will do all we can to publicize the Frankenstein Then and Now edition. I don't know if you have any final thoughts about Frankenstein and what's next for your work with Mary Shelley.
I have moved on. I don't know about you, Jerrold.
Well, I'm still working a lot with the interplay between the Gothic and the Romantic in texts of that period. And right now I'm working on a book about Mary Robinson, who Anne has written about too, who was notorious as an actress and mistress of the Prince of Wales, but who became a major critic and poet in her own right, and used the Gothic more and more in her work, novels and poems. It's amazing what she wrote in such a short amount of time. And a lot of what Mary Shelley later developed is developed in many ways in the work of Mary Robinson. So I'm looking forward to delving more and more into that.
Wonderful, thank you. And Anne, even if it's not Shelley related, what are you working on at the moment?
At the moment, I'm focusing on Jane Austen.
Oh, fantastic.
Which is a very different set of concerns, issues. Although one of the things I'm really concerned about is the issue of slavery, especially in Mansfield Park, of course. But Mary Wollstonecraft defined British wives as slaves in the civil sense. And I'm really interested in the way Jane Austen takes on that reading of Wollstonecraft and works it through all of her novels. So that's what I'm thinking about at the moment.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, that was an extra question that I just wanted to hear about what's next.
Well, I guess we'll allow it.
So yes, huge thanks to our interviewees, Anne Mellor and Jerry Hogle, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening to this K-SAA interview, and look out for more like this on our blog and social media. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, inviting us.
Thank you all.